Hello, my name is Philip Lynch. I'm the Director of Special Education for Montgomery County Public Schools. It's an honor to be here with you, and I wish we were all in person. I know that Adam and our hosts had worked really hard to organize an experience for you that would be in person and we could see each other face to face. Unfortunately, that's not the case right now, but I look forward to seeing you in the future, and I know that I'll be among you and be in front of you someday soon. In the meantime, I wanted to use this recording as a way to share some of the information that was expressed to me that was needed in order to help inform your community about the special education services that are offered in Montgomery County Public Schools, the process for students becoming eligible for special education services, and some information about what the educational services and that plan, the individual education plan, looks like, some key components of that plan. So I hope to be able to share that information along with some valuable parent resources that will be a part of this presentation, so that when I'm not with you and you need to do some more exploration or you have concerns or questions, that you can go to our website and avail yourself of a lot of the resources that are out there. And if you're interested to explore them a little bit in further detail, there's a lot of resources there for parents who are looking at the possibility of a student potentially having a disability, or the potential of engaging in the evaluation or eligibility process for special education services, as well as for parents who currently are engaged in receiving those services for their student, who also may have questions about how to better prepare for meetings and to help them learn more about a very complicated process that is special education services. So I hope to go over that information with you in the next few minutes, to share these slides with you that I'm going to be putting up in front of you here, and then in that way I'll give you also some resources where you can find some additional information. I'm going to take a minute now to put some slides up on the screen and go through those for you, and I hope you find them meaningful. So this first slide really is just introducing myself, and I will say before I start that my background really is one of special education. I come to administration from early beginnings of being a special education teacher. I'm now in my 31st year in special education, but spent many of my early years as a teacher. I am from the area and worked locally in the Silver Spring area at Silver Spring International Middle School and another school for students with disabilities that's in the area. From there, I went on to become a leader within my building, in my school, moved on to central office as an instructional specialist, became a supervisor for the down county area for the schools in the Silver Spring area, Tacoma Park area, for 7 years, and then moved on to being the director, and I'm now in my 6th year as the director of special education services for Montgomery County. And it's really it's been an honor to serve the Silver Spring and down county area for so many years, basically my entire career, and then to be able to take that experience on to the larger Montgomery County community as the director for the entire county. This next slide really demonstrates the timeline that we are guided by when we look at considering whether a student who we may suspect has a disability, in fact, is eligible for special education services, all the way through the assessment process, determining eligibility, and developing an education plan for that student. You can see here that a referral for special education services is able to be generated from parents, from teachers, and also from students. We do have some students for whom, when they're older, may advocate for themselves. So those are the folks who may generate the initial referral and say, hey, I suspect that there's something going on here and we need to take a closer look. From there, a team would hold an IEP screening, or what we call a child find meeting, to review data, and they would have 30 days really to do that to conduct that initial meeting. If the team suspects that there is a disability, there would be a request for authorization for assessments to be completed so that we could do some formal and informal assessments to determine whether the student does in fact meet the criteria. By law, those assessments, once they're agreed to and authorized by parents, must take no longer than 60 days. So that's really this window here where you have 60 days to complete that assessment process. Overall, from the beginning of the referral process all the way to the end when teams are determining whether a student is eligible, there's a maximum of 90 days by law that is allowed for that process. That initial stage, that screening meeting, there's no law that shares that it must be within 30 days, but we know that if you go beyond 30 days, you're going to start to give those people that may have to do assessments less than the 60 days in order to complete that overall 90-day timeline. If a student, after the information is all shared with the education team, including the parents, determines that a student is eligible, and I'll be talking about eligibility in a moment, the team then has 30 days to develop what we call an individualized education program. That's an IEP. And so again, the first stage would be referral, then a meeting to determine whether there's a suspicion of a disability and to get authorization for assessments. At that time, the team would decide what assessments are appropriate. The parents would sign authorization. There's 60 days from that point for the assessments to be completed. And at the end of those 60 days, there would be an evaluation or eligibility meeting in order to determine whether the student meets the criteria as a student with a disability. If the student does meet that criteria, the team would have 30 days within which to develop an education plan, and they would return to another meeting to talk about that education plan. Parents will be provided a draft of that plan in advance of that meeting, within 5 days of that meeting, to review it, and then we'll be able to come back and discuss it at the meeting. I mentioned eligibility, and there are 14 different disability descriptions that are considered valid within the United States that fall under our federal guidelines. I've chosen to just focus a little bit on 2 of those disability areas so you can get an idea of the type of information that special education teams look at when they're considering whether a student meets the criteria for a disability. One of the most common disabilities is what we refer to as a specific learning disability. And when we consider whether a student is eligible for a specific learning disability, we first have to determine whether there's an area of educational impact, meaning, is there an educational area where the student is underperforming? This could be any area that's associated with reading, with math. It could also be areas that may impact students in other ways, like organizational areas. And so the data that we currently have on the student in terms of their classroom performance, their district-wide data assessments, their statewide data assessments would be reviewed in order to look at whether there is an area of educational impact at first, and then the team would do some standardized testing in order to determine how the student is achieving on those basic academic measures. If it's determined that a student is in fact underperforming in one or more educational areas, the team would then look to see whether there's what we call an uncommon pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, is a student very strong in some areas, but show weaknesses in other areas? Does the student have strong or high cognitive levels? We typically refer to those, or we've referred to those in the past as IQ scores. So is the student, do we know that the student is capable of learning, but for some reason, and maybe that reason is a learning disability, something is getting in the way of some aspect of their learning? So we see what we call an uncommon pattern, meaning that it's not a pattern that we see in most people, but it might be for a small percentage of students that have a learning disability. And so if we see that pattern, then we would say, okay, this is a student who has impact in a certain educational area. We see an uncommon pattern where they're strong in some areas, but weak in others. And then we would move on to what we would refer to as exclusionary factors. We would ask whether there is some other reason why the student may be underperforming and make sure that that's not the reason. So we would want to make sure that that we're excluding other possible reasons for the underperformance. So, for example, does the student have a vision concern or a hearing concern? Was there some reason why the student has not been appropriately accessing instruction? So have they missed a lot of school for some reason? So if we determine that the educational impact or the deficit area might be due to one of these other factors, we would say that the student is not eligible for a learning disability, and we would need to make sure that that those other areas are addressed. For example, if the student needs glasses, then we would make sure that they get their glasses. If they have a hearing challenge, we would make sure that the hearing issue is being addressed. We would not find a student eligible if we could point to one of these other factors that's impacting them. If we're able to rule all of those out and say that none of those exclusionary factors exist, he's been coming to school or she's been coming to school on a regular basis, there aren't any hearing or vision issues, there are no other factors that may be the cause of that educational impact, then we would say this student could be eligible or would be eligible for a learning disability. So those are the three areas that are examined when you look at whether a student is eligible for a learning disability. And that would include getting some formal assessments completed in order for us to look at whether the student is suffering from some sort of educational impact and whether there are patterns of strengths and weaknesses. So that would typically look like an educational evaluation. I know that some members of your community had asked about eligibility process for students on the autism spectrum. We refer to this as autism spectrum disorder. And I just wanted to share with you some of the pieces of data that we review when we look at whether a student is eligible as a student with a disability on the autism spectrum. And so those data points include review of records and parent interviews. So taking information from the parents and taking information from the students' educational record. So that might look like going back and looking at report cards, looking at teacher comments to see whether there are patterns that align with the characteristics of a student on the spectrum. There also would be observations that would be done, typically by the school psychologist. Observation data would be collected in terms of looking at how the student is performing within the classroom. We would look at behavior rating scales. So behavior rating scales, it's really a questionnaire that is responded to by a group of people. So that could be done by parents, by teachers, by staff that work with that student on a regular basis to determine what types of behaviors may be interfering with the student's educational process, and also whether those behaviors are in line with what we would typically see for students on the autism spectrum. We would look at adaptive behavior rating scales. Adaptive behaviors are a fancy way of saying that, how does the student function in real life activities? So how well do they communicate? How well do they take care of themselves? So adaptive skills could include daily living skills that might be everything from, getting dressed in the morning, brushing your teeth, helping to take care of yourself. That's an adaptive skill area. As I mentioned, communication is an adaptive skill area. How well does a student communicate with peers and with others? How well do they communicate their wants and their needs? So adaptive rating scales are really focusing on how do they function in their daily living and in their communication. Another area would be looking at cognitive measures. So those again are going to be what we in the past had referred to as IQ tests, but really looking at how the student processes information. And that's going to typically involve a psychological assessment. We would use this information in conjunction with other data, academic data, looking at how the student's performing academically to determine whether they have areas where they are high achievers or areas where, again, that they have deficits in their academic performance. All of this information would be reviewed, discussed at the IEP evaluation process. together in order to determine whether this is a student who meets the criteria for a student on the autism spectrum. And so that's those are the key data points that are typically used. In order for a student to be considered eligible, or when a student is considered eligible as a student with a disability, two key phrases that you might hear throughout the IEP process are free and appropriate public education. So once a student meets those eligibility criteria for one of those 14 different disabilities, of which I just went through two of them, learning disability and autism, the student would be then by law eligible for FAPE, or what we call a free and appropriate public education. The development of the education plan that I'll talk about in a few minutes is really key in making sure that students are receiving that free and appropriate public education. And they are eligible to receive that education in what we refer to as the least restrictive environment. And that sounds like a confusing term. What it really means is that the student should be receiving those services with their general education peers or with their non-disabled peers as much as possible, trying to limit the amount of time when the student would be isolated or without being in connection or contact with their non-disabled peers. So that's really what's referred to when we say least restrictive environment. So I've just added those terms here because they're really important for you to understand if you're endeavoring to go down this road or into this process. FAPE and LRE, least restrictive environment, are really common terms, and it's really important that you have an understanding of those two terms. This diagram really is showing you the key components of the IEP. I structured this to look like a building. Because it's really trying to drive home the fact that certain aspects of the IEP are the foundation. And so when you see this term present levels, it's really referring to present levels of current performance. That's really the data that we have about your student that is demonstrating how they're currently performing. So how are they doing in math? How are they doing in reading? What is their reading level? What is their writing level? That data really is what is at the foundation of a student's education plan. The roof, or the piece that is kind of overarching all of this development of the plan, really is that least restrictive environment. That's the setting in which the student will receive their services. And remember, I said that we are charged with trying to deliver services for students in the general education setting as much as possible, and really making sure that students have access to their general education peers as much as possible. So that's over the overarching component. The pillars are some of the key components of the education plan, and I'll just say briefly what they are, and then I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. So one pillar is really participation. What assessments and what curriculum is the student going to be participating in? That's one key aspect of the discussion. Another one are what we refer to as accommodations. So due to the student's disability and their present levels of performance, what type of accommodations do they need? Do they need additional time on certain activities? Do they need certain types of support for testing situations? So really accommodations are listed in the education plan that align with what the student's needs are. Supplementary aids and services are similar to accommodations, but you can think of them almost like teaching strategies. So what are the teaching strategies that this student might need in order to best access instruction? So accommodations are almost like the rules that need to be in place for this student in order to access, and supplementary aids and services can be thought of as the strategies. Each student will have a set of goals that align with their present levels of performance. So for example, if a student has an area where they're underperforming, let's say it's a reading comprehension, so they're having difficulty understanding what they're reading, they would have a goal on their IEP that would be developed that would help clarify what are they working towards when they're trying to make improvement in the area of reading comprehension, and how are they going to work towards that goal? That goal would have objectives, meaning smaller steps along the way. And so the goals are really what the student is working on, or the teachers are working on with the student over the course of the year. The education plan is written for 1 year, to cover 1 year, and the goals would be written to cover 1 year. Those goals would be reported out on a quarterly basis. So each goal would be shared with parents, and the progress on that goal will be shared with parents, typically at the same time that their report card is shared. So you can see what progress students are making towards meeting that goal over the course of the year. So I mentioned earlier that participation is one of the discussions. And right now what I'll do is just go through some of those key components of the IEP and just show you, this is actually the page. I know that that's difficult to read. I just wanted you to see that each of these sections of the IEP has its own component. And the participation page really focuses on the students working towards graduation and what their requirements would need to be in order to meet those graduation requirements. What types of assessments are they going to take? Are they a student who also needs instruction in English language proficiency? And what statewide assessments are they going to take? Are they going to take the state assessments that are aligned with graduation, or are they taking assessments that are considered to be alternate assessments that are aligned towards receiving a certificate of completion? So that's the participation page. The present levels of performance is a really key part of the IEP. It lists each area of academics, including behavioral areas, and it lists out on that section how the student is currently performing in each area. So what are their reading levels, writing levels, math levels, and it also then gives an opportunity for the teacher to describe some of the data points that are aligned with that. So what data do we have that shows us that the student is performing at that level? And it also might include a narrative that describes some of the things that students are struggling with or what they're doing well. So that's the present levels. There's a section of the present levels where parents also are able to provide information based on a questionnaire that they're given leading up to the meeting. Parents would fill out the questionnaire, and that information then would be included in the present levels of performance. So parents also have an opportunity to share what they see from their student in terms of their strengths and their challenges. Special considerations is a page that discusses whether the student has communication needs, whether there's a need for any assistive technology or special services, whether the student has a need for a behavior intervention plan, or again, whether they are English learners. So I mentioned accommodations, and the accommodations are broken down into these different areas. Students may need accommodations for accessibility purposes, or the way in which material is presented to them, or the way in which they may be responding to information. So the accommodation may be given to them to respond in certain ways. An accommodation to take an assessment in a smaller group if that's what is considered to be necessary. Supplementary aids and services, which I referred to as strategies, are broken down into these areas. Those strategies could look like instructional supports, modifications to the programs, school personnel or parental supports, behavioral supports, social behavioral supports, or supports that are in the physical environment. And there would be an opportunity for the staff to list whatever those needs are within the classroom for students to access the curriculum. These are some examples of different types of supplementary aids and services. For example, it might be determined that a strategy the student needs is that they need a picture schedule, or a student might need manipulatives. They may need assignments to be broken down to smaller units, or proofreading a checklist. Proximity control means that the teacher may be moving throughout the room and helping students to stay on track by standing next to the student or helping to clarify where they should be working or focusing them in on a certain aspect of their work. So this is a terrific slide that gives you just some examples of the different types of supplementary aids and services or modifications and supports that might be available to students for whom they qualify and for whom their present levels of performance, their academic performance demonstrates a need for this type of support. Extended school year, or what we refer to as ESY, is a 4-week summer program that is that students for whom are eligible for special education services may continue to receive services. In Montgomery County, it is, like I said, 4 weeks. It's a half-day program, and there is a portion of the IEP that the team goes through to determine whether students are eligible. Typically, students that are most impacted, students with significant disabilities, are eligible for ESY services, and that's a part of the process. I mentioned that we would help to develop goals for students based on their areas of deficit. This is what a goal page looks like. So the goal is written here. It really describes then the criteria by which the student's progress is going to be measured. It looks at what the objectives or the steps along the way should look like. And then there's a section on the goal page where the teacher or case manager that's supporting that student would mark their progress. This would be the information that would be sent home to parents on a quarterly basis to help parents understand whether their students are making progress on each of their goals. And then a portion of the IEP that really focuses in on what the services would look like in terms of who's going to be providing the service, how much is going to be provided, is that going to be provided in the classroom, in the general education classroom setting, or is the student going to receive that by being pulled out of the general education classroom setting? So the description of those services is a very important part of the conversation. It also discusses how long the student will be receiving those services. Will they have support for 1 hour a week in a reading intervention? Will they be receiving a monthly support for a speech and language disability? So that service page really provides that description. As I mentioned, the roof of that building earlier was the least restrictive environment, and I shared that is the guidance that overarches all of our conversations, really trying to make sure that students are receiving their education with their non-disabled peers in the general education setting as much as possible. And so a portion of the conversation in the education, of the development of the education plan, is really about where those services will be delivered. And if the student is going to be removed from the general education setting, this is where the team would really discuss why that's necessary and make sure that it is necessary to, in order for the student to make progress. And coming to a close here, I wanted to just make sure that that you understood that there are some wonderful resources on our special education website. If you were to go to Montgomery County Public Schools website, mcpsmd.org, you would see that there are links you would have access to these links that are really helpful. So, for example, this is a link that will take you to our overall web page. I'll show you what that looks like. And you can see here that there are a host of opportunities for you to explore on the left-hand side here, some of which are the parent resources. I'll just show you real quick one more slide or one more link here, and then you can explore these on your own. This lists a description of all of the different programs and services that we offer Montgomery County if you were to go to that link. And And I think I'll show one more. This slide really is helpful because it gives you links to a lot of different documents that are designed to support parents as they work through the IEP process. So there's a plethora of different links within this a web page that will help to support parents throughout the process. Information about grading and reporting, and also links to the Maryland State Department of Education. Links to different associations that you may find helpful if your student is eligible for a disability in a certain category. There are links there. There's also a wonderful video here that is designed to share what happens leading up to the IEP meeting, and some information about understanding and monitoring your students' success. That's a parent workshop that you can view. So there's just a wealth of wonderful resources. If you were to also go to the Montgomery County Public Schools webpage and just type in special education, it would take you right to these resources. You would see the parent resource page, and that's an easy way for you to get to these same links. We also have what we call a Special Education Advisory Committee, and that committee is a small group of executive members, but we welcome all community members to a monthly meeting that takes place on the fourth Thursday of every month. Right now, we are performing those meetings virtually, but if you want information about the calendar for those parent meetings, you can go into our Special Education Advisory Committee webpage, which is also on our website. It'll give you a calendar, and it gives you access to the email addresses for all of our co-chairs for our advisory committee. Those monthly meetings are a valuable resource for parents to learn about what's going on, key topics that are being discussed and delivered throughout the course of the year. So again, I want to thank you. I want to thank my host and everybody who helped to put together this event, and just say to you, I hope in the near future I'll be able to see you in person, face to face. I'm sorry that this has to come to you by way of a recording, but I do look forward to seeing you all again soon in the community, and I wish you the best. I really hope that this information has been helpful. Again, I'm Philip Lynch, Director of the Department of Special Education Services. Take care.